Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SITREP. SITREP is a notorious open-source intelligence app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SITREP, for sponsoring this episode. Welcome to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. My name is Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And today I'm joined by our chief correspondent, John Larrier, our regular guest as always. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, they're good to be here, man. Thank you.
And we have as our special guest today to cover everything related to Russia-Ukraine, the great OSINT Technical. OSINT Technical, thank you so much. I think a lot of our listeners know you very well from your account on Twitter, or now known as X, but I'd love for your listeners who might not be very aware of a quick bio on kind of the things you've been working on right now. But again, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thanks for having me.
So OSINT Technical, I know you work for 100 Brick Media. You've done a lot of great reporting, a lot of areas that you kind of focus on. But for the intents and purposes of this episode, we really want to focus on Russia-Ukraine, which is one of the areas that you've probably been most focused about. We briefly covered this in our last podcast, where we kind of gave a broad overview on Russia-Ukraine and the Ukrainian deep strikes and the strikes in the Sea of Azov that really has been hampering Russia's logistics overall and the ability of Russia to sustain their presence in Crimea. But for our listeners, I would love to just give you the opportunity to kind of highlight the major issues that are going on currently in Russia, Ukraine. What are the things that in your reporting and the things you're tracking that has been most noteworthy that our viewers and listeners should be made aware of?
Yeah, so I think to contextualize since I last came on, I think we've really seen not so much a change in the war in Ukraine, but more an evolution in the patterns that have already been seen. I think, we've seen this sort of gradual move in the way the war has been fought over the past 2 years. And I think the name of the game is drones at this point. That is sort of the coloring factor to this war. And when you look at sort of how things have gone, you really have to divide it into three areas, which is frontline gray zone. Then you have your middle zone, and then you have your deep zone. And you can sort of contextualize all those by where the strikes are happening. So really in your gray zone right now, though you are still seeing very heavy reliance on guided bombs and artillery systems, up into the front far more, you're seeing limited mechanized movement and a really, really big reliance on unmanned systems, both to conduct strikes and also increasingly conduct resupply missions. Whether that be through the air. I think there was a very recent, or at least just a few days ago, Ukraine's 3rd SSO Regiment ended up delivering an entire order of KFC to one of their frontline units through a heavy bomber drone. So we're seeing a lot of resupply action conducted through the air. We're seeing a lot of it on the ground through UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles, mostly to move sort of heavy loads of supply both in and out to the front. One of the things that really does sort of characterize the frontal situation right now is the sort of at least some retention of okay road surfaces. So unmanned ground vehicles have really been a key factor in moving stuff into very, very dangerous areas of the gray zone. And then, of course, you have the unmanned strike systems. So that's going to be the things that are actually hunting down soldiers and other weapons systems. And really, it's turned this gray zone into a very unfriendly place to be. And because of that, and because of the Russian strategy to counter that, which is basically just pushing through very small units, over the past 12 to really 18 months, we've seen something where the gray zone has steadily expanded. And I think, some people have started to just call it a kill zone at this point, but it's basically this 30 to 40 kilometer thick strip of land between both sides where the front line is very mushy. You have sometimes individual small groups of, 2 to 10 Russian soldiers multiple kilometers behind Ukrainian positions. You'll frequently have Ukrainian positions pinned on towns that are very isolated, are occasionally resupplied by land, but very frequently only resupplied by air, with very, very limited rotations. We've seen cases where drone units have been sort of single-handedly holding areas without any people present. So we've really seen just this increase in automated warfare, or at least remote warfare. And I think that's one of the things to remember with this war is that Ukraine is increasingly sort of fighting with a lower manpower advantage, but with a significant drone advantage, both through electronic warfare capability and enablement, and their ability to communicate with their drones with systems like Starlink, which has really allowed them to sort of have both a qualitative and quantitative advantage in that gray zone. So, sorry for kind of ranting there,
No,
but
no, no. That
it's
is
been a lot.
phenomenal. That is a phenomenal thing because that's literally what we've been covering in a lot of our previous episodes about this, where, one of the issues we saw on the Ukrainian side is this consistent, persistent issue with manpower, but how they've been able to augment it with drones to the point almost where, I mean, we're tracking right now just for our listeners to understand, we're recording this on the 26th of July, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And right now, currently, there appears to be another large-scale Ukrainian drone strike. And I bring that up because one of the things that we're looking at is that the Ukrainians are able, in many ways, to replicate American, the air dominance doctrine of persistent and consistent strikes, but instead of using manned aircrafts and persistent, 24/7 OCA or DCA, they're kind of leveraging their drones to do this. So I think that explanation really matches everything that we've been kind of covering here. But one of the questions I have to ask you, OSINT Technical, is obviously this week we've seen a flurry of changes within the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, within the Ukrainian military. Obviously, their commander in chief, the senior military commander, has been relieved. This predecessor something that we covered in a previous episode where the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense was fired. I just feel like I have to ask you this question before we expand on the points that you brought up earlier, and that is, do you think the firings and the changes was more of a political necessity? In other words, Zelensky maybe felt the pushback from the firing of the Minister of Defense and felt like, okay, to do something to mitigate this. Or was there a more political necessity, or was there a military necessity for doing this and reinforcing this new adaptation of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense to this kind of drone warfare?
Yeah, so I think it's a bit more complex in that, and I hate to sort of harp on this issue, but Ukraine is in an interesting position right now where there's very high political participation. There's very high civic involvement in the government, but there haven't been any elections in years. So we're staring at a situation where everyone is working through this very odd lens, of what's going to happen next. We've seen, the beginnings of competitions to be the next leader of Ukraine, sort of people jostling for position effectively. But at the same time, we're not seeing something that's illiberal in a way. We're not seeing the populace being cut out of these public decisions. So we're seeing just a very interesting interface between what normally are only palace politics and public politics. So one of the key things has been, if anyone, and I hate to keep saying key things because there are just so many elements here that really roll up into the current Ukrainian political system, and it's a very rare one to see. But when the Ukrainian government makes these oversteps, when these sort of palace politics decisions, where it becomes effectively, and I know you covered this on the last one, but the Minister of Defense Fedorov, basically, saying we need to fire the head of the army or the head of the military. And that comes back and ends up, basically getting him fired because there's a power play, and then everyone gets fired by the end of it. But one of the elements there is that the Ukrainian people came out and protested in Kiev, and it became a very rapid pressure point for the Ukrainian government to recover from this firing of a popular figure. And so I think, where there are sort of disagreements on how to fight the war, a lot of it is internal jostling for position combined with this external civic participation, and it's very interesting to watch because it's fairly novel. It's something that we don't see that frequently.
Yeah, if
Eh,
I could ask a quick question too, man. So one thing that's been a huge thing here has been the Fedorov's, well, the former. It's unsure what his position in the following months and weeks will be, but that the kind of revolution that he did in tech and introducing new processes to the Ukrainian military. A lot of this has also potentiated their strike campaign, which I believe Zelensky just announced today that they've and just this year they've conducted, I believe, 1,000 standoff strikes into Russia, and that they currently maintain a capability to strike 3,000 kilometers. Do you see a change in kind of this strike campaign, or do you think they'll double down on this, as Zelensky has said in his statement today?
I mean, they've been pretty clear that this is working for Ukraine. This strategy has both sort of created an untenable situation for Russia and Crimea with the current power strike campaign. It's completely denied the Black Sea to Russian commerce and the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The Russian Black Sea Fleet at this point is legitimately only able to deploy into the harbor of Novorossiysk to conduct missile attacks. They do not go outside their home harbor anymore. It's also, of course, caused massive damage to the Russian oil refining system. And overall, the entire Russian petrochemical system has been devastated by Ukraine's long range strike campaign. So at the end of the day, I mean, this is something that's been built up, and they aren't going to stop hitting the free wins button effectively. So that's probably an area where they're not going to drop away. Though I think also at the same time, it's been much of a group effort. When you look at what's going on at Firepoint, when you look at what's going on at individual units, it's been sort of an almost organization-wide effort to push forward these changes. And I think it's important to remember that aspect as well.
Yeah, I think that's great that you mentioned Firepoint. I think my next follow-on question there would just be, where do you see their defense industry continuing to produce standoff munitions and standoff capabilities? Where do you see it going next here? Do you see it kind of doubling down on Flamingo-type weapons, cruise missiles, long-range strike capabilities, or do we see another kind of asymmetric axis of advance that they possibly will try and implement here?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to Flamingo is inherently limited. There have been some fairly major strikes carried out through the system, but its hit rate is pretty low just due to the nature of it's a large RCS object. The Russians have started to adapt to Ukrainian strike patterns, and so there's some advantage there. I think that Ukraine both is starting to receive some externally manufactured system. You look at the Ruta from the Netherlands. That's looks like it's starting to come into use. Ukraine's going to be receiving hundreds and hundreds of those missiles. But we're also probably going to see more of a push towards the low RCS Tomahawk-like long-range missiles that Ukraine is looking to procure and actually deploy. Um, on that side of things, they do appear to be receiving also licensed build permissions for the Storm Shadow and Scalp. So that should fill some of the gap there. But I think it's important to remember that Ukraine is working with limited systems at the moment from a technological perspective and from frankly a unit cost perspective. If you look at how the Flamingo is actually built, it's a very cobbled together system. It works because it works, but at the end of the day, obviously it looks like everyone is trying to see how do we evolve from this? How do we get the next thing? And when you look at how Firepoint has worked, just recently they revealed the FP1 extended range variant, which sort of tacked on another 1,000 kilometers of range to the system for what appears to be a very low cost. And so you're seeing a combination of new systems being introduced and these older systems being iterated and sort of built upon. And that's again, it's a hodgepodge effort, but Ukraine is working with what it has.
So let me follow on that from John's question because you were mentioning specific productions of more offensive capabilities, but we also seen reporting from a domestic perspective on the U.S. and defensive capabilities that Ukraine looks like they're going to get authorization from a license perspective to produce PAC-2s, PAC-3s, these Patriot interceptors that kind of a lot of the issues that have been highlighted in the United States where there's kind of this concern of a critical shortage of U.S. interceptors in the Middle East. Is there a scenario where the Ukrainians, because of this, right, from the Storm Shadow, the Scalp, the Patriot interceptors, might become a major defense production area for the West as a whole that then can enable kind of these solutions for the United States, for Europe, et cetera, both in combat operations in the Middle East or maybe even contingency operations in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think we should all fool ourselves. There is a lot of institutional sort of inertia in the US that does resist some of these newer systems being instituted, both for very legitimate concerns and some that are less legitimate. Ukraine right now, obviously, if they receive a lot of these defense manufacturing licenses, they could very easily become, a re-exporter of Storm Shadow and Scalps to help fill back up, UK, or Franco-British stockpiles that have been really drawn through. But we're already seeing, Ukraine starting to export both technologies and some drones at this point, both, in a limited manner to the US and also some European countries. So I think, we're already seeing Ukraine become this exporter of defense tech. But it really depends on what they're able to develop, what licenses they're able to put together, what the Ukrainian needs are for those systems. And of course, receptiveness to these new systems. I think if you look at the European militaries, they've reacted and pivoted very hard to the way that the war is currently being fought in Ukraine, just due to the nature of, their location. Um, and what the threat is. I think if you look at the way the US wants to fight in the Indo-Pacific, um, you know, I think they're observing the evolution and they're sort of watching how systems are changing to a degree. There's resistance and obviously the way that, Taiwan, first island chain and into the Pacific it's a bit of a different battlefield than Ukraine, Russia. I think, seeing the first USV strikes against Iranian positions was more of a I hate to say it's a bit of an overblown thing, but at the end of the day, we dropped, what was it, three-ish million dollar USVs into a sub pen when frankly it was something that like maybe four or five $30,000 JDAMs could have done. So I think the US is sort of trying to find a way to use these systems, but there is a bit of that institutional struggle.
And related to kind of the situation along the front lines of the tactical sense in Russia, Ukraine. I mean, we did see, kind of it's been, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, OSINT technical, pretty rare to see armored assaults. Recently, Russia mounted an armored column assault in the Donetsk Oblast, specifically in the Dobropila area. Multiple Russian tanks, infantry fighting vehicles were destroyed. What is the sense that you're getting from in the tactical sense? I mean, is the situation pretty static? Are there fluctuation in territorial changes? Is this a situation where, as you alluded to in the beginning of this, where the gray zone is becoming more of a kill zone, so that's limiting territorial change? I mean, what is the latest update from a tactical sense across Russia, Ukraine, and the battles that you're seeing there?
Yeah, so I think, and just to put what you said in a bit more context, a few days ago, the Russians tried a relatively large armored assault out of Pokrovsk, and it went a bit disastrously. They lost something like 80% of the vehicles involved. I think it's important to remember that right now, The biggest loser in the way that the war is currently being fought is the armored vehicle. It's very vulnerable to drones. It requires a large amount of support. Not only has the gray zone expanded, but the middle strike zone has expanded, and the systems that can reach into the Russian rear, where your column now, from the very second that it's forming up, 10 kilometers behind the front line, it's getting hit all the way up to that front line and into the advance. It's just getting swarmed by unmanned systems, and also targeted by artillery and some of the more traditional systems. So you really lose that ability to put together mass. I think the big enemy right now in the gray zone, in that middle strike zone, is massing forces, because they will get targeted, and the capabilities to target, any location has just sort of gotten out of hand. So I think the thing that the Russians have pivoted to, and this is sort of where the general war has gone to, is Russian small unit infiltration tactics. The Russians have sort of switched to the strategy of, I don't want to say meat waves because that's not really what it is, but a willingness to take immense losses, by pushing through, infantry units in very small groups up to and then through Ukrainian positions. So the Russians know that the Ukrainians have fairly little manpower on the front. It's not every tree line that's filled with Ukrainian trenches. It's really Ukrainian strong points, that are then backed up by unmanned systems. So you see Russian infiltration groups, two or three guys, sometimes four or five, sort of move past Ukrainian positions, take an area, and then attempt to move enough Russian forces in that the Ukrainian position then becomes untenable in the area. So you see these very slow Russian advances through the gray zone, and I think that's been the theme of the past 18 months now, is that the advances are slow but steady. They do speed up in urban areas because urban areas seem to be a real enemy of unmanned systems. It hampers your ability to conduct targeting. It allows, these small unit infantry tactics to really work their best. But then when you go to areas in southern Ukraine where it's been a really open front line, and I mean the small unit tactics are very, very costly to achieve any advances. We're talking about sometimes thousands of soldiers lost to capture just a few kilometers of land. And so those areas you've seen the front line really stall up. And then in a few really limited areas, Ukrainian forces have put together some manpower, to attempt to really close that gray zone up. I think the one thing there to note is that because the gray zone is so large, if you achieved some force presence, you can shrink it a bit pretty easily. So we've seen efforts, on the E-105 highway, in southern Ukraine out of, uh, uh, I believe, Kamyansky. There's been some intense fighting over these two towns. Just Ukrainian forces kind of want to recapture this river line, that they've been holding for a while. So, you're seeing very limited Ukrainian offensive, actions, but it's mostly a defensive fight on that. And the main thing is just the Russian losses have been horrendous. We're talking about 30,000 casualties a month or more, which is.
Actually, let me ask you this question then, related to that, because I mean we saw a reporting that the CIA director John Ratcliffe said that their assessment mirrors OSINT reporting. This is something we covered in our last episode, where the average lifespan of a Russian soldier in the front line is anywhere between 20 to 30 minutes, which seems abysmal and terrible. Is this something that, as related to what John Rafko said from OSINT reporting, kind of tracks and mirrors what you're saying, and does that highlight the issues of the Russian casualties that we're seeing right now in Ukraine?
So I think, the problem with that number is that it can be really variable. I think the way that people have arrived to it is basically, sort of averaging out losses. So, you might have some soldiers surviving a very long time, and some being killed, behind the front line. I think the main thing to remember here is not so much average Russian survival time, but sort of casualties for land gained. And I think if you look at the monthly figures of, overall Russian losses, versus the amount of land that they're actually, gaining, taking, and holding, um, it's very one-sided in that manner. You're just seeing these just massive losses to take very limited amounts of land.
And one of the areas where and John, I'll go to you right now, where I found it very interesting is, I mean, this is something we talked about very earlier in this, is how the Ukrainians, just a quick commentary, have been able to succeed in this by leveraging unmanned systems, right? Because historically, the famous term was the king of battle, was referred to as artillery, right? Historically, 70% in modern warfare were killed because of indirect fires, specifically from the artillery. And that now has been, for all intents and purposes, completely replaced with UAVs. And I think the Ukrainians, because of the lack of manpower, the lack of systems, they've been able to switch, the very famous saying, necessity is the mother of all inventions. They leverage UAVs to do that. And I think that's a very interesting dynamic. And the question is this just a one-off because of the specific issues of Russia, Ukraine? Or is this going to be a pattern that we're going to see spread in various areas? And what would be much more interesting to see is if we see this in the West. But John, I know you wanted to jump in, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I think just to piggyback off kind of what the conversation you guys were just having, I think the question I would have is, we've seen open source reporting that suggests that, yeah, this fall Putin was going to announce renewed mobilization of up to, I believe, 500,000 men. Is OSINT technical? Do you believe that this is indicative of the fact that what you kind of did, what you not characterize as meat waves, but what some may characterize as meat waves, that because of the nominal success of this tactical and operational, kind of the way they implement their offensive operations, do you think this is indicative of that they're going to continue to double down on this, pairing this with drones and other tactical level implementation as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Russians or Russian leadership does really think they can chew into Ukrainian positions and potentially achieve a breakthrough by just throwing men at the problem. I really do think that they can just, burn through troops and take horrendous casualty figures, in order to, capture these areas. Um, I mean, I think the Russians are looking into the midterm and the long term. They are potentially prepared to fight for another 5 years, and maybe suffer another maybe million casualties. That's a huge question of what the Russian people are willing to suffer, what Russian leadership is willing to throw at the problem. But right now, they seem to be willing to take, frankly, abhorrent casualty figures to move forward. And it doesn't seem to be causing any problems. We're not seeing any generals getting fired. We're not seeing, um, very clear displeasure in Russian leadership. So they seem fine, to adapt to that issue. I will add, and I think that it's, we may overlook some of the more traditional elements, but if you look at Ukrainian artillery expenditure, recently, and production rates, we're still seeing a lot of artillery used on the battlefield. I think it's still a very large portion of the actual explosive mass that's going downrange on both sides. One of the key things to remember, though, is that whereas a drone system has a camera and you're seeing the videos from that drone, you're not seeing it from that artillery shell going downrange. Um, and so there is that side of things where, it's not survivorship bias of the media that you're watching, but there is a certain element of, there's a lot of artillery going downrange, on both sides. It's just you're not seeing videos of it. So it definitely still is there.
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned that kind of the Russian people and kind of their threshold for well, I guess what my question would be is, what do you think the threshold for unrest with the Russian people is, or also with the oligarchs and the current military and civilian decision making framework that's under Putin here? Do you think that they'll be able to sustain this for another 5 years with Ukraine conducting strikes on the oil and gas sector and deeper and deeper into Russia, and as they continue to threaten rear areas. Do you think that's sustainable for the next 5 years, as you kind of surmised earlier?
I'm unsure. Frankly, if you look at the history of Russian civil unrest, everything is great until it's suddenly really not good. You know, things tend to melt down in Russia very, very quickly. You know, they can sustain a lot of you know, economic damage and sort of civil damage before, you know, the populace turns. But once it turns, things go sideways very, very fast. Um, so I think, you know, there is a lot of willingness among the Russian populace to take some of this damage. They really haven't seen that much harm from the war yet. Um, the Russian economy has been remarkably resilient and ushered through by the Russian central bank. You know, that's put together a very, very effective counter to both international sanctions and Ukrainian war damage. As well, if you look at the regions that have actually sustained the most economic damage, the most sort of pain to the civil populace, it's been near the Ukrainian border with sort of constant drone strikes. It's been in southern Russia, so sort of Volgograd region, Krasnodar, those Crimea areas with huge fuel shortages. And you know, central Siberia into eastern Siberia, where you've seen the most economic damage. The thing to note there is that's not Moscow suffering, and that's not St. Petersburg suffering. The political base of what is objectively the Russian Empire has been fairly insulated from the practical damage of the war. And when you think about where the civil unrest in Russia really hits, it's civil unrest in Moscow. It's civil unrest in St. Petersburg. Those are those historic two areas where that hits. And as long as those populaces are continuing to be insulated from the effects of the war, you're not going to see that unrest that really affects the heart of Imperial Russia. And of course the Russian government is very aware of that. There's a reason why Moscow is the, you know, most heavily defended area of Russia right now. There's a reason why they've pulled back a lot of air defense assets to guard the capital. It's really because they want to keep that area sort of secure.
And one of the things you sent OSINT Technical, which is, and I want to pinpoint this, you mentioned that you think the Russians do believe that they can achieve a breakthrough. I'm not trying to make this a snipe question, and to be honest, I don't even want to ask you if it's realistic. I really would like from your perspective, just if you're analyzing the Russian mindset, when you say a breakthrough, do you believe that in the Russian construct, in Putin's mind, they can achieve a tactical level breakthrough, an operational level breakthrough, or even a strategic level breakthrough if they continue to throw, you know, men at the problem and more bodies and more equipment? Is there a mindset where the Russians think that when you say breakthrough, they might actually maybe not necessarily seize Kyiv, but defeat the Ukrainians wholeheartedly and strategic and have their capitulation? Is that within the realm of possibilities, at least from the Russian mindset?
I mean, look, Russian leadership is very clearly not exactly operating on the same mindset and possibly frame of understanding that we are. So
They're
there's a lot of
delusional, if I may say, to be honest, my perspective. But please go ahead.
yeah. I mean, if you look at the maps that have been leaked that sort of Russian leadership is presenting to Putin, it is very much delusional. I think that, you know, there's the belief among Russian leadership, or at least the forced belief in order to make Putin happy, that they are winning right now. You know, that Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are going to fall any day. You know, to sort of this massive Russian advance. Um, I don't think we're seeing that practically right now. Um, you know, if there is a large scale mobilization, though, that may present some additional issues. You know, the Ukrainian army is decidedly undermanned at the moment for the threat that they're facing. And throwing another 500,000 troops at the issue, especially if Russia chose to, you know, go on a new front again, that could be a real threat, though that raises some significant potential problems, um, you know, domestically in Moscow if they were to reinstitute a draft, if they were used conscript soldiers again in Ukraine. I think that, obviously we go back to what the domestic pressures are, and really a lot of the draftable and sort of, mobilizable Russian population that it would willingly go to Ukraine has already signed up as a contractor or contract forces. So you're really running into the limits of what you can actually mobilize here. And again, this is really just finger in the air, and I could be completely wrong. And I think a lot of us don't have the greatest insight into where that Russian breaking point is, and where those available manpower numbers are. Um, it's just it doesn't seem like Russia can really sustain at a super high level for an indefinite amount of time.
And let me ask you two specific Ukrainian strike campaigns. This is something that we covered in our episode last week that we kind of saw a continuation. And this week we probably said a new one, much more expensive. So there's one is like the Ukrainian strikes in the Sea of Azov, clearly trying to disrupt the logistical aspects in Crimea, but would love your overall take on that strike. And the other one is the strike against these wildberry facilities, logistical areas where, for our listeners, I'm going to try to simplify this as much as possible. Wildberry is a Russian company, for all intents and purposes, very comparable to the American Amazon, right? And we're seeing the Ukrainians conduct a lot of strikes targeting these facilities. So one, please give us an explanation, overview in the strikes in the Sea of Azov and what that means and entails and if it's effective. And two, for Wildberries, my specific question is this much more trying to disrupt a military logistical problem set that the Russian military is using these facilities for logistical reasonings? Or is this much more geared toward trying to disrupt the Russian economy overall?
Yeah, so on the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov side of things, I don't think I can mince words here, but it's been catastrophic for the Russian shipping on the Black Sea, like completely just an utter shutdown. The Don River, which is this absolutely key river basin that runs from sort of the tip of the Sea of Azov, connecting the Black Sea to additional Russian inland ports and waterways. It's a navigational channel. I don't want to compare it to the Mississippi River, but similar in nature. Traffic on the lower portion of that waterway has been completely shut down. The Russian ability to move goods out through the Black Sea and then past Turkey, that's effectively done at this point. That's no longer really just a thing that they can rely on. We've recently also seen Kazakhstan completely suspend oil exports through the Black Sea due to the risk of Ukrainian drone strikes. So to say that campaign has sort of slowed down because it's been too effective too quickly, but that's effectively where that campaign lies. On the Wildberry side of things, I think it's important to remember that the Ukrainian leadership has been pretty clearly messaging that they are conducting a campaign this summer, their 40-day campaign, to directly target not the Russian populace itself, but things that make the Russian populace comfortable. The Ukrainian government very clearly wants to, in a measured way, bring the war home to the Russian people. And as part of that, that involves, strikes on Russia's equivalent to Amazon. It involves going after Russian oil and gas. It's effectively making gas lines that are 5 to 6 hours long. And if you look at where the initial targeting of Wildberries warehouses have been, overwhelmingly it's been Moscow and St. Petersburg. That's where the bulk of those strikes against Wildberries infrastructure has actually happened. So it really goes back to the Ukrainians trying to send a message and effectively shut down Russia's largest e-commerce chain.
I guess the question then is, I mean, we're getting a lot of conversations from the Ukrainian perspective, right? On the strikes, kind of the operations they're doing at the front line. I mean, we talked a lot about the tactical, operational, strategic way of war that the Ukrainians are doing. But it seems like it's banking on this Russia will to fight, right? Which is something that we kind of covered already, which is very difficult to assess and it's hard to do. But it's almost as if the Ukrainians really don't have a desire to, in a sense, take the initiative and set conditions themselves. And they're kind of banking on doing operations that force Russians' hands. Do you think OSINT Technical, with the new leadership in the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and the commander in chief, the removal of the previous one, that we might see a Ukrainian plan to say, look, we can't fight years like this and hoping to set conditions for the Russians to finally raise their hands and say we give up, that maybe they need to maybe fix the manpower shortage, launch offensives, seize significant amount of territory that really changes the tactical, operational, strategic picture inside of Ukraine, but more from a maneuver warfare rather than just a warfare. Is that something that you see as in within the realm of possibility?
I do not, and I don't think anyone in the Ukrainian leadership does either. Even, Syrskyi, who is one of the most aggressive, highlighting the assault corps, making sure that's where the manpower is, fighting advances where possible. Even he understood that, large scale offensive operations were just off the table. I don't, Ukraine just can't support that due to the nature of how the battlefield is. I mean, Ukraine can't support 30,000 casualties a month. It's just Ukraine is a smaller country. Like you're just working with a lower manpower base. And that's really why the unmanned side of things has won the debate so heavily, because that's what they've found to work with current manpower restrictions and the way that sort of the gray zone has expanded, especially the summer 2023 offensive. I think if you put all those things together, it's sort of created not institutional fear, but an acceptance that large scale combined arms operations, they just aren't going to be happening on the Eastern Ukrainian front line anytime soon without some sort of significant change. If you look, Ukrainian mechanized units have been overwhelmingly rotated back into the rear to, kind of just sit around and serve as very low manpower garrison troops at this point. Ukrainian armor at the front line has effectively disappeared. And so I think we're gonna, those assets still exist, but the conditions right now just don't allow for their utilization. And
Yeah,
so yes, there is a big question mark long term about what that means for the Ukrainian capabilities to continue suffering casualties and fighting a defensive war. I think at least the hope right now among Ukrainian leadership is that Russia will not be able to continue to fight something like this long term, and that long range strikes coupled with middle range and even short range stuff will be able to sort of put Moscow on the back foot economically, and sort of put more of the impetus upon Russian leadership to strike a peace deal.
yeah. I think a question on that before I guess we pivot to Iran is that do you see Ukrainian leadership deciding to conduct some level of increased mobilization in the near or long term? Do you think that military and civilian decision makers are pushing Zelensky to do such a thing, or do you think, kind of like you said, that there's that acceptance that this is not something they can do right now or even in the near future, so therefore they're not going to suggest it?
Yeah, people are fighting for it, but I don't think right now there's the economic and political willpower to do it. Um, there is continued mobilization, but it's been at a low level. I think that in general they have found the degree of active mobilization at which they can keep up for a longer term. So there, I don't think or there isn't this room to maneuver and create 10 more brigades. They've kind of hit that operational limit. If Russia were to mobilize 500,000 troops, if they were to start really going in the direction of re-escalating the war to a new level, I think that does start to raise alarms in Ukraine about increased mobilization and manning. But at the same time, that also, a mass Russian mobilization would be raising alarm bells further west as well into the European capitals. So I think, obviously we enter a bit new of a ball game then as well.
Right. Thank you. So something that you've also covered a lot, I think we all have covered a lot here, is the ongoing situation in the Middle East between the United States and Iran. It's obviously expanded to Israel, basically every single Gulf nation, Iraq. Jordan, and then Oman and Yemen as well too. Um, just kind of this, I'll start out with kind of a broad question. Kind of what do you see went wrong at the start of major combat operations that saw them prolonged so long? Do you think the regime change, the attempted implementation of regime change was kind of foolhardy to even begin with? Yeah, I'd just love to hear your take on that.
Look, I could talk about this for hours, and I think, many have sort of put their thoughts to paper on what this is, and I think it's something that we're probably going to get a better understanding of in a decade, when the people who were in the room when those initial decisions were made, actually write down what the thinking was among, the people who made those decisions. But I mean, very clearly, the U.S. did not properly assume what was going to happen. I think if the decision makers had known, we'd be in August at this point, Hormuz would still be closed, and we would be starting to see a degradation in U.S. missile defense capabilities because of renewed massive Iranian ballistic missile raids again in August, months and months and months after the start of fighting. I think the discussion to go to war would have been significantly different. Um, at the same time, I don't think that this was necessarily unexpected among at least people who have studied, the likely outcome, or sort of what would likely happen in a war. I think everyone assumed that, Iran has a very large missile force. Then add in the number of available U.S. interceptors in region, and you can start to do the math there. Um, I think Iranian resilience to U.S. strike campaigns has been a bit surprising. They've obviously taken immense amounts of damage to both production infrastructure, or correction, they took immense amounts of damage to production infrastructure until the ceasefire. And then we're allowed to reconstitute for what we're going on a solid 3 months here, of sort of broad, you know, guard, or a lack of bombing, or a lack of any sort of campaign against internal Iranian targets. Um, so I think, when you look at how this campaign has gone, it's gone in a lot of ways that people wargamed it out to go. Um, and there may have been internal thinking that, a sudden strike in the initial days of the war may have decapitated the Iranian government, and driven some sort of Venezuela style regime change. Um, those were very clearly mistaken beliefs. Um, if you see where we are right now, which is effectively a very thin, effective ceasefire over U.S. concerns to both the global market and to, our capabilities to strike and degrade Iranian capabilities to control the Strait of Hormuz. And I'm trying to be guarded with my words here, because it is still a flowing situation, but it very much seems like one where we've kind of already lost just by playing the game.
So,
Yeah,
if I may, actually, let me ask a question to you both. Actually, I want to ask a question to you, John, and one to U.S. and technical. Is because part of the strike campaign against the Russians in the Caspian Sea, Ukraine hit a maritime vessel in the Caspian Sea that killed an Iranian merchant sailor. And the Iranians vowed response. We've seen in Iranian propaganda channels and state media claim that they're going to conduct a retaliatory strike against Ukraine. Basically, this thought process of in Iran, no strike goes unpunished. So my first question is to John, and then my second question is to you, OSINT technical, but kind of similar. Like John, to you, I mean, you've probably seen this. Do you think that this is not only one, a credible threat, but two, do you think the Iranians are going to conduct a response because of the strike? And if so, how does that look like? And then OSINT technical to you, the kind of the same question. Do you think, the Iranians are going to respond, and how would they do that? And do you think if so, do you think the Ukrainians are going to retaliate? But John, would love to hear your take first, then we can go to OSINT technical.
yeah, thanks. I think that first off, any threat from Iran, it should be deemed as a credible threat, especially given the situation and the motivations behind their threats right now. Um, given the inundation of strikes and that they've been under. And so any ally of the United States, they kind of they see as an enemy as well here, especially Ukraine to more so, especially after this strike here. Personally, I just like to pivot real quick. I think it's kind of ironic that Iran is so up in a tizzy about a strike on a civilian vessel after they've been striking dozens of civilian vessels for the past couple months. That being said, though, I don't think we'll see anything kinetic from Iran against Ukraine. I think that would be awfully foolhardy, especially given Ukraine's asymmetric capabilities here. I think Ukraine could cause a lot of problems for Iran if they wanted to, not only abroad, but also in the region if they wanted to. We've seen Ukraine do this for Russia and Africa. We've seen Ukraine do this even for, I believe, Assad by giving some direct support to HTS elements with drone capabilities and things like that. Although, albeit that was very small, I just don't. I think it would be foolhardy from Iran. Uh, Now, given who's kind of making the decisions in Iran, though, at the moment, though, which is largely IRGC generals, that remains to be seen whether or not they're willing to make a foolhardy decision. But I think right now, I think the threat should be deemed as credible, but we won't see anything kinetic as of yet. As I understand it, I believe there is also some back channeling possibly going on. We saw some Ukrainian diplomats speaking with their Qatari counterparts in the past 24 hours here, and there's no doubt that that is Qatar mediating some sort of diplomatic effort, possibly between the two. So that may be ongoing as well, too, I believe. So I think we need to wait and see here when it comes to the Iran-Ukraine dynamic. But I do think it is awfully ironic how pissed Iran is about Ukraine striking a civilian vessel after they've been doing it for months.
Yeah, I mean, barring the absolute irony of the entire situation, um, Iranian capabilities to conduct a large scale response against Ukraine. I'm not saying it's limited by practical terms, but you know, are they going to fire 10 ballistic missiles at Kiev? What does that look like? Are they going to fire missiles at Europe, which introduces a very new dynamic to the campaign? And at the end of the day, they've had immense cooperation with Russia, on the defense side of things. So it's not undeserved that Ukraine would be conducting strikes in the Caspian Sea. And this isn't the first time it's happened either. The other strikes that we've seen have targeted Russian ships heading between key Iranian ports and southern Russia. But this isn't the first time we've seen it. I don't think it's going to be the last time we see it. And at this point, most Iranian threats are going to be saber rattling in that direction.
Yeah, just to tack on the end of his point there, right? I mean, everybody knows the Jaren 2 is a license-made Shahed drone, right? And so Ukraine readily understands that, I think Ukraine was also likely happy to see some of those Russo-Iranian trade networks on the Caspian Sea in northern Iran get struck by Israeli strikes, very, very as much as the U.S. or Israel wants to see that stuff. So, I mean, this is a dynamic that I think has kind of always been going on, and Ukraine has likely always viewed Iran as a hostile actor, especially after the direct support for the Russian war effort. But yeah, I largely agree with technical here. I don't see them launching ballistic missiles at Kiev. I think any type of response is going to be either through back channels, or it's going to be largely under the guise of other operations here.
I mean, what I think is very interesting here, right? I mean, I think we got some reporting about kind of the reason why the United States has given diplomacy a chance is because this concern of constraints of the air defense interceptors. There was but most of them were like, "Oh, we'll give diplomacy a chance." We saw the Omanis have conversations with the Iranians. And I just want to provide a kind of separate outlook of this, where some of the arguments that are being made, and this is actually kind of some of the reporting on I-24 and other Israeli media, and some of these, how they're framing it is more like it's almost as if the reporting of the concerns about the interceptors is almost as a ruse. Like, yes, there's a concern, but it's obviously not the big one, and that the reasoning
It's
why.
oil. It's oil.
Well, it's not only oil, but it could be oil, right? And I would disagree with you, but it's almost like this. It's kind of like this argument where before the war started on the 28th of February, right, which was, oh, we're about to get a deal. We're about to get a deal. We're about to get a deal. And what it was is it was the U.S. was trying to pre-position forces in theater to enable the next phase of major combat operations, right? Because what was interesting was Axios reported that Admiral Brad Cooper said, basically he went up to the Joint Staff, to the president, and said, look, the current strike campaigns have reached its effectiveness. Like, it's very hard at the current structure of the strikes that the United States did for the last almost 2 weeks, 13 days. There's not much more targets to hit related to the Straits of Hormuz and Iran's ability militarily, outside of the psychological police, but militarily to close the Straits of Hormuz. And so his argument was, unless we go back to major combat operations, it's really not worth it. And so the question is, because we're seeing tankers flowing into Israel, we're seeing more assets going into. Maybe there's an issue of resupply from the United States, equipment from the United States getting sent over to the Middle East. But is this a possibility that if diplomacy doesn't go, the United States needs more time to get everything in place to conduct a next wave of major combat operations, as seen in February and March and April, and that we're likely to go to there? Because obviously, in diplomatic front, I think neither you, Osin, technical, or John would make an argument that there's a diplomatic breakthrough right around the corner.
I mean, let me raise this question. Where does a large scale strike campaign get us?
No, I mean that's the issue, right? Unless the only thing that I can see is from a large scale combat strike, right? I mean, Brad Cooper in the Axios report, they said there's about 20% of military targets that the United States is looking for. Clearly, that's not going to be enough. So the question is, the only thing left, if you want to change the calculus on the ground, is regime change. Now, the question is regime change achieved? Because you're starting to you're putting the pressure from an economic side, which we see has limitation. Do you continue to do assassinations at the higher echelon? For example, do you assassinate Muqtada Khamenei? Do you find his location, assassinate him, the new IRC leadership? Do you continue to kind of degrade until it's hard for Iranians even to find their own replacement? So is that an aspect? Or number three, and more importantly, more interestingly, do you try to foment something inside, and maybe this plan of the Israelis with the Kurds comes back to life in other avenues and venues inside of Iran, where it's maybe not necessarily regime change per se, but it's at least as a regime collapse that then enables the Straits of Hormuz to be reopened. And I think I would not discount that possibility, where the Israeli plan, specifically related with the Kurds, with the regime change, now gets a new Saints alliance. And look, Monday, tomorrow, Benjamin Netanyahu is going to Washington, D.C. to meet President Trump. We all know this is going to be front and center. So I think that wouldn't be a out of the realm of possibility, in conjunction with strikes in some sort of, not only the military side, but the economic objective as well.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, I don't think you get out of any of those engagements without just catastrophic damage to oil infrastructure across the Middle East. And I don't think that opens the Strait of Hormuz at the end of the day. You might try to foment a revolution, but again, how many Kurdish fighters are willing to go fight in Iran right now? From the initial numbers and the initial reports, they maybe had a few thousand willing to, actually enter the fighting in northwest Iran. That doesn't really do anything against, even with heavy air support, both Iranian paramilitary and regular military forces. It's just, I don't think it's realistic. And then you have the whole equation of then the Turks join the Iran war on the side of Iran. Or maybe not the side of Iran, but definitely the side against the Kurds. So you run into that problem on one side of things. The other problem is, like, Iran has built its military, and I think we've seen this very, very clearly, to survive horrific levels of decapitation. We're talking about, like, just everyone in senior leadership, getting blown up pretty regularly. Just catastrophic degradation of the even capabilities of, like, individual units to communicate. And yet those units have still been able to put together effective attacks, with the missile forces, with individual air defense units. Towards the end of large-scale combat operations, we saw a fairly rapid series of shoot-down incidents that indicated that the Iranian air defense forces if not reconstituted, had at least gotten their shit slightly together. So I think, any sort of engagement where we want to go back to large scale war is going to end up with this damage across the region that I don't think they're willing to take. If you look at stuff like distillates right now, especially diesel fuel, which is essential for everything effectively, that's very quickly going towards $6 a gallon right now. Couple that with the Russian export ban and damage to the CPC and basically everything out of Central Asia right now, you end up with a situation where a large scale supply shock, especially with the Houthis entering the war, and they have at this point. The economic damage to the West is significantly more in our face, and this very real and present danger versus where it was in February, which was a bit more hypothetical. I think we have to balance that when looking at what a large scale campaign to topple the Iranian government looks like.
I mean, John, I would go to you, but I think that what this war is showing is that there is a possibility, obviously, with air campaign and inducing costs, etc. But there's obviously limitations, and I would think, and maybe this might be a good opportunity for us to look into our next episode, is what comes out of tomorrow's meeting between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Trump, because I think there's a lot of conversations that are going to go related to Iran. Because John, I think that's going to be the key focus for the next week.
Yeah, I 100% agree there. I think that's going to be the next focus here. The biggest thing for me too is that we've seen kind of, and I don't know if I was talking about this with you and Matt or somebody else, but it's kind of been a pattern here that whenever we see renewed strikes, we see Trump and Netanyahu have either this kind of public falling out, and then Netanyahu into visiting, or Trump visits him, and then we see strikes on Iran or strikes on the Houthis or whoever else, right? Joint U.S. Israeli strikes, that is. And I think we can all agree here that Israel joining this war again would escalate the war significantly, especially with the Houthis now involved. Um, uh, on kind of resuming major combat operations, I was the guy before about a year ago. I was the guy who was saying, bomb them. They need to realize consequences for their actions, specifically talking about the Houthis and then about Ukraine, right? Or else they're going to continue we're going to continue to realize Iranian aggression throughout the region, right? That didn't work out. And so obviously I've had to shift my kind of assessment of this, right? I believe in May, I'm just looking up old reports here. In May, right, the president was mulling striking 25% of the targets that the U.S. had marked out but hadn't hit yet. And I've always wondered what percentage of that has these limited strikes on regions adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz. What percent has that met, if that at all? And so I was wondering about, oh, maybe this might be the way to go about it. But at the end of the day, right, I do agree with you that a regime change is really the way to go about this. Technical, you mentioned the Houthis, and I'm glad you did mention the Houthis. I don't know when you guys want to wrap or not, but I do think we should mention the Houthis because doing this whole nominal ceasefire and then the MOU, nominal ceasefire framework process, and then the MOU framework, during this whole time, we've seen a parallel escalation ladder between Saudi Arabia, the Houthis, and the internationally recognized government in Yemen that's also been climbing here. And I've largely assessed this to be a parallel escalation ladder here. But at the end of the day, now that the Houthis are now firing missiles off into the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb Strait area, and then also directly against Saudi, it serves the same purpose that Iran wanted it to serve anyway here. What's your general take on that? Do you think the Houthis will continue to escalate? Will they possibly strike Israel as well, which will then induce an Israeli response? What's your take on that?
I mean, I think we're probably going to see a rough parallel to the Iranian escalation. I think if things calm down and we don't see any additional Saudi strikes, we'll likely see Houthi strikes limited to attacks on Saudi vessels that get too close to the strait. If, though, the U.S. decides to escalate and start a larger scale campaign, I think the door has been opened for more Houthi action in the region now that we've kind of crossed the threshold of the first strikes. So there's obviously a bit more room now for the Houthis to conduct these operations on the political level. And we've already seen the Houthis conduct a very much a statement attack against Jazan, the city in southwest Saudi Arabia, conducting a strike on a fairly major Saudi Aramco refinery, and causing what appears to have been heavy damage to it. That seems to have been, again, effectively a statement at this point, but it's one that was very effective in saying, we are prepared to strike oil and gas infrastructure. This is something that we very quickly could escalate into causing large scale economic damage. And I think that's where this war has gone. I think both Iran and their allies have realized that the lever of pain, for the West, has been economic damage through oil, gas, petrochemicals. If you look at where their escalation ladder ends, it is striking economic targets. It's striking oil and gas targets. Data centers, for some reason, the Iranians have been relatively obsessed with that. If you look at where those strikes eventually lead, it is very much pressuring the American public directly.
Right. So you think it's fair to assess that this is something that's really largely parallel, not necessarily in concert with the ongoing Iranian escalation?
Oddly, somehow the Saudis managed to escalate it, or the Saudis and the Houthis kind of escalated on their own, sort of insulated from the wider regional conflict, though obviously it was colored by those wider regional events. But really, I think they're now moving back sort of into parallel.
Stefano.
So yeah, I would like to say, I think this is a good time to finish this conversation in this episode. I mean, we've been going for over an hour, and I know OSA Technical, we can
Get
have you
off!
we can have you on for like 4 hours, man, because there's so much to talk about. But I think talking about Russia, Ukraine, and Iran has been great. So I want to thank you, OSINT Technical, for all the conversations that we had. John for co-hosting, but OSINT Technical, I'll give you the mic, and John as well, to kind of give you your guys' parting thoughts. But I think this was a phenomenal conversation. So OSINT Technical, please go ahead.
No, I mean, thank you so much for having me. Obviously, we're dealing with an incredibly complex situation right now. We've seen interlaced global level conflicts in multiple regions affecting global commodities, the international systems, U.S. defense budgets, interceptor resources. If you look, basically, there's this massive line that runs between Iran, Russia, Ukraine, and the Middle East, and we really are seeing, and I hate to say this, but this multi-regional war, that is directly affecting our daily lives. It's directly affecting the price of the gas pump that you go to. It's affecting electricity prices. It's sort of shipping rates at this point with the Red Sea. um I think that it's something that people try to ignore, but it's becoming more and more ever present as we see it escalate and simmer.
John, would love your final takes as well.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. One thing yeah, kind of in jest, I'd say, technical. Don't let the World War III doomer accounts hear that last
Oh
part
no,
of
I'm
your
not. I'm
take.
not going to say the word, the banned word.
I know. Don't say the forbidden Voldemort word there. But no, I do agree. It is something that is becoming increasingly interconnected, as evidenced by recent developments between Iran and Ukraine, and then obviously Russia's support for direct support, whether it's material support or intelligence support. We've seen Iran increasingly getting more accurate in the strikes, likely on the backs of Russian intelligence support here. So it is something that is increasingly interconnected here. Obviously, there's lots of lessons to be learned when it comes for a war in the Pacific here. China is always watching here. And I think one thing that I like to remind people always, that China is another nation that has a large stockpile of standoff munitions as well. And they're looking to see how Iran is implementing their strike campaign, and what's beggaring Iran's enemies will likely beggar China's enemies in the same fashion, just in a different theater of war. That's all I got.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for joining us. OSINT Technical, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We definitely learned a lot, both from Russia, Ukraine, and Iran. Would love to have you back soon to kind of cover the latest developments there, because obviously a lot of the episodes we've been covering have been much more focused and centered on Iran. This has been a very much needed update on Russia, Ukraine as well, and deep dive there. So we want to thank you for that. To all our listeners, make sure you follow OSINT Technical if you don't already. He's already a legend on X, formerly known as Twitter. But if you don't, we'll make sure to share his handle on the description of the podcast. But with that, this has been the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast, and we will see you all soon.